here to tell you that either you change these things about your life or you're going to end up in flames. I think I'd be impressed. I think that would impact me. Sometimes funky, supernatural, weird stuff changes people's lives. I have a friend, and I kid you not, who came to know Christ, gave his heart to Christ on an LSD trip because Jesus talked to him through this poster. It was a rock and roll poster, and all of a sudden Jesus was there and said, you either change your way or you're heading towards destruction. And he repented right there and then, and it changed his life forever. He's still a Christian to this day. And to this day, he insists that was not the drugs talking, that was the real Jesus. Now, I don't know and I don't care. God will use any means possible, but I'm just telling you, sometimes weird, funky stuff like that impacts a life forever. So how can Abraham here say that it wouldn't do them any good if someone were to come back from the dead? And if apparitions and ghosts and manifestations sometimes change lives permanently, how much more a resurrection where the tomb is actually empty? What makes me even more puzzled is that in the Bible, the resurrection of Jesus changed some lives permanently. Paul, he sees Jesus, the resurrected Lord, and it changes his life forever. You've got the doubting Thomas. You've got James, the brother of Jesus, who wasn't a believer during Jesus' life, but after the resurrection, he becomes a believer. And so the manifestation of the resurrected Lord changed lives forever. So how can Abraham be sitting here saying it wouldn't work? Sometimes it does work. Now, the answer to that, I think, is this. Notice that the resurrection didn't work for everybody. It worked for some. It didn't work for everybody. There's a passage in Matthew chapter 28 where the resurrected Lord appears on a mountaintop to a whole bunch of people that says, many believed, but some doubted. It didn't have that effect on everybody. And the Pharisees, they knew the tomb was empty. But rather than that fact kind of opening them up to the possibility that maybe Jesus was who he said he was, they made up a story about it, and they knew it was false. Well, we'll just tell people that the disciples stole the body. And they knew that that didn't happen. So how did the resurrection help some but not others? And the answer, I think, lies in the nature of a person's heart. If a person is genuinely and authentically open to truth and open to God, then supernatural manifestations and rational arguments will help convince them of the truth. But if a person's heart is not open to truth, not open to God, is resolved against it, all the proofs in the world and all the supernatural manifestations in the world aren't likely to help them. And we need to remember that this parable is being told primarily towards the Pharisees. In fact, he's telling this story in response to what he says in verse 14, that the Pharisees were sneering at him, snubbing their nose at him. And so he's telling this story in response to them. It's directed towards them. So the reason Jesus has in this parable Abraham say that it wouldn't do any good to send Lazarus to warn the brothers is because these brothers represent the Pharisees. Like the Pharisees, they have hardened hearts. The Pharisees not only knew Moses and the prophets, but they were the experts on Moses and the prophets. And so if anyone should have been able to recognize the Messiah when he shows up, it should have been the Pharisees. Especially in light of the miracles and especially in light of the fact that he rose from the dead, the Pharisees should have been the first ones to notice it and recognize him, but they didn't. They refused to believe even with the miracles and even with the resurrection. And the Pharisees should have been, as experts in Moses and the prophets, and knowing all those hundreds of verses about our responsibility for the poor, they should have been the first ones out there caring for the poor, but they didn't. Their hearts were hard. Like the Pharisees, the 5 brothers knew all they needed to know about the poor, and in the case of the Pharisees, about Jesus, to get their lives in line with God's will. They just didn't want to do it. And Jesus is saying that for people like that, getting more information won't help, even if it comes from an already deceased person. Because the problem when you're dealing with people like that is not a lack of information. The problem resides in the nature of their heart. And this reveals this very, very important truth. A person can know a truth, but convince themselves they don't know it when they don't like the implication the truth has for their life. Let me read that again. A person can know a truth, but convince themselves they don't know it when they don't like the implication the truth has for their life. Now, that principle in this parable gives a strong warning to non-believers who maybe are listening to this message, whether you're in this auditorium or listening through some other means. You may be hearing this and you have not yet submitted your life to Christ because you're just not convinced that He is Lord, that He rose from the dead, and all the other things. And it may be that the reason you're not convinced that Jesus is Lord and that He rose from the dead and other things is because your mind hasn't yet been convinced. You have a heart that's open to God and a heart that's open to truth, but your mind has not yet given you permission to believe. And if you're in that situation, I bless you, and I just encourage you to keep on looking into it honestly and objectively, because I believe that your mind will eventually find reasoning enough to submit your life to Christ if you're genuinely open to Him. But it's possible that there are some listening to this who you are not convinced that Jesus is Lord and that He rose from the dead and other things, not because of your head, but because of your heart. And no one can judge you about this because no one knows the nature of your heart except God. But it's possible that God knows that you already have more than enough knowledge to act on. You just don't want to because you don't like the idea of someone being Lord of your life. You like being Lord of your own life. And the warning that this parable is giving to you, if you're in that situation, is that you are in a dangerous situation. If you don't act on what you know, you may find yourself losing the capacity, eventually, to act on what you know. If you don't act on the light that you have, you might find that eventually you begin to lose the light that you have. You begin to grow blind. If you don't act on what you know, you may come to the point where you wouldn't be convinced that Jesus is Lord, even if He showed up personally to you. And I don't say that as a scare tactic or anything of the sort. I'm just making this general observation that whatever we do, we get good at doing. If you're open to the light and you respond to the light, you act on the truth that you know, you get better and better and better at that. The more you respond to the light, the more light you have. But if you don't act on the truth that you know and you don't respond to the light that you have, well, you start to get good at that. And you start to shut that out, and that becomes a habit, and that becomes part of your character. And before you know it, you're entirely blind. The more you respond to light, the more light you have. But the more you refuse, the less light you see. So the clarity that you have today, you may not have tomorrow, which is why I encourage you, if you haven't submitted your life to Christ and there's a pull there, I encourage you to act on that. Because I can't guarantee that that pull will be there tomorrow or a week from now or a year from now. It's urgent that you act on the truth that you know. This principle has a warning to believers, to non-believers, but it also, I think, this parable has a warning to all of us, believer and unbeliever alike. The principle that if you refuse to act on what you know, you may lose your capacity to act on what you know applies to all of us in different ways. To see this, let's ask the question, how could it happen that these brothers, as well as the rich guy who's in Hades, how could they get to the point where God knows that they would not respond to the gospel even if someone came back from the dead and told them to? How could a heart get so hard? Imagine, in this parable, it assumes that the brothers, as well as the guy in Hades, that they're all Jewish. It assumes then that they know Moses and the prophets. Therefore, they knew the hundreds and hundreds of passages in Moses and the prophets that concern the warnings about greed and the responsibility to help out with the poor. But over and over and over again, they refused to act on those teachings. Imagine for a moment this rich man while he was alive. As a good Jewish person in the first century, he would have went to the synagogue every Saturday. To get to the synagogue, he had to walk out of his house and walk past that gate, and therefore walk past Lazarus, laying on the ground there emaciated with the dogs licking his sores. When he gets to the